Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, I decided after this last video I did, which you couldn't see me, I figured I should do a video where you can see my face. But maybe it's not a good idea to see my face in this video. I've been told I do not have a good poker face. So I'm going to be talking about some things about Powered by the Apocalypse games and kind of like the narrativist creative agenda. And every once in a while my face may belie my preferences, but this is not a video about narrativism bad, or Powered by the Apocalypse games bad, or simulationism good, or anything else. But every once in a while, being a human being, my face may otherwise give away some of my preferences or gut level reactions or what have you. I've been thinking a lot about these Powered by the Apocalypse games lately. I've been reading a whole ton. I've been talking to a bunch of people very recently, and in the last, like, say, 48 hours or so, I've been thinking about them an awful lot. You know, having had some experience, playing one, going back and diving in and looking at a bunch of games that I have. And, like I said, talking to some people about it. And it's funny, you could not have found a person that was more opposed to the GNS theory, or what became the big model, than me. I just did not buy into it. By being a little bit more open-minded over the last year, like 2 years, and just kind of examining that a little bit more, I have found that it's proven itself over and over again. And to me, this is just a very useful way to look at various games and realize what the creative agenda was when they made this game. What kind of experience is that game going to produce? Whether it's a gamist creative agenda, or a narrativist creative agenda, or a simulationist creative agenda. Now, people aren't narrativist or gamist or simulationist, but we do tend to gravitate towards games that produce a certain type of experience. And it is amazing how often we can use the same words, think we're talking about the same thing, and completely miss each other. And it's evident to me sometimes when I've read some of these games, talked to people about these games, that sometimes we have that happening. What's really funny is, I have a couple friends that I believe have different. I mean, I don't want to peg them in terms of what kind of games they like, but Powered by the Apocalypse games tend to create or support a very narrativist creative agenda. I have some friends that aren't really. That's not really the top thing. I don't believe that they're really into, and they have read these games and come back and talk to me and have the same experience that I had, where they had to read them a bunch of times trying to figure out, well, how the heck does this work? What is this really about? I can't find it in here. And sometimes I believe what happens is you're so used to you have such a different intent for what the experiences you want to get out of a game, that sometimes a game that supports a different agenda may make no sense to you whatsoever. Or you may have to step back and start to see it through somebody else's eyes. So that's part of what I've been doing here lately. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today was sparked by some comments by a viewer of mine whose name is Ann R, or their YouTube name is Ann R, A-N space R, so hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, although I think I can pronounce the letter R okay. But some interesting things came up in that discussion. First of all, I'm going to try to look through these comments here, so it might take me a second to get to the right one. But the viewer mentioned that, if you think that conflict should be part of the game and you try to force them into a Powered by the Apocalypse game, you're changing the game at its core. The game is fiction first. You don't want to look at things aloofly and judge if you need a conflict or not. Just follow the rules. If you trigger a move, you trigger the move. Otherwise, keep playing. It's not about conflict, it's about moves. And so I had to think, when did I say conflict? So I went back and took a look at the video I made yesterday, where you can see my face. And sure enough, I said at one point, as I'm looking through these various games, and as I've played, there's a time when you think to yourself, there should be a conflict here somewhere. And what I meant was there should be a move. And my idea wasn't so much that it was a conflict like you against somebody else, or that I wanted there to be a conflict. It was one of those moments where you're playing a game, and it doesn't matter if you're playing Powered by the Apocalypse game, or you're playing Lamentations of the Flame Princess, or what have you. You get to that point where everybody says to themselves, yeah, there should be a die roll here. This is hard. This is dramatic. This is something. And we'll take the example I used in the other video. It doesn't matter whether I'm running Powered by the Apocalypse or Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Your character is running away from a bunch of people, running for their life. You decide, I want to scurry up this building as fast as possible, go hide in the shadows at the top, be unseen, maybe see what they're doing next. Everybody knows at that point, time for a dice roll. Doesn't matter what game you're playing, unless your character is some kind of superhuman. However, at that point, how we view that event may be a little different depending on what our agenda is for the game, and what kind of agenda the game supports. Somebody like myself, I tend to gravitate towards games that produce more of a simulationist narrative agenda, meaning that I like to experience what it would be really like to be, my character in this world if this world were actually real. And so it's a little bit different than the agenda that the Powered by the Apocalypse games tend to support. So when I look at moves, I tend to see them as a little bit like task resolution, in which, of course, Anne mentioned to me that it's not a task resolution game, it's a game based on moves. And I believe that sometimes what happens is it's a matter of intent and what the games were created to emulate in the first place. And part of, one of the things I also mentioned in the original video I did yesterday was the idea that I would really love to play something a little bit more generic. I want to go play using that mechanic, because that mechanic really intrigues me. That 2d6, you've got this ternary result. Is it a miss? Is it a weak hit where you get what you want, kind of, but you get complications, or do you pretty much get what you want? I really like that. And I've actually, to be honest with you, I use that in my Lamentations of the Flame Princess game all the time. If we come up with a situation where I'm not really sure what would happen, or I think that might be kind of interesting, there's not really a rule for this, I'm rolling that all the time for these guys. They may not know it. I actually told a couple of them, what I'm actually doing, when I roll those dice. But that's a great tool to use. But if we just play a game and that's all we're doing, there's let me see. I got a whole bunch of Powered by the Apocalypse games here, and one of them said something very interesting. I believe it was Spirit of 77, one of the ones that came in the Powered by the Apocalypse bundle. And early on in that game, it says everything else in this book, I'm paraphrasing, is the really nuanced rules, but you can play with just this mechanic, But I was thinking and having some conversations with some people, at what point, are you no longer playing Powered by the Apocalypse, even though you're using that mechanic, even though you're using that method to resolve a situation? And, that's an interesting question. So that's part of what I've been thinking about and talking to people about today. And there is an intent in a lot of these games, as I read them, that they're sometimes reading these games is almost like reading a pitch for a movie or watching a movie trailer. You know what this is going to be about. You get the basic idea of what that story is going to be like, because it's very clear. They even write it down a lot of times. This is the intention. This is the kind of story that you're going to create. Not that it's a script, you know what's going to happen, but you kind of know the arc it's going to take. You watch a movie trailer, you've seen a ton of movies like this before. It's an action thriller, and okay, there's going to be chases, there's going to be heroics, there's going to be setbacks. The main character is at the end going to kill and catch the bad guy, maybe at a terrible cost. Some of the supporting characters may die, you're not sure. And there's probably going to be a couple times where the bad guy gets away in some set. So you know kind of what's going to happen, you just don't know exactly how it's going to happen. And no game says that better than I think it's Action Movie World, First Blood, which even says right there that's exactly what that game is supposed to do. It goes so far as to tell you choose one person to be the lead character. This guy has total plot immunity. He's going to kill the bad guy or catch the bad guy. He can't die. It's just great. And he's the only one that can catch the bad guy. The supporting characters can't. That game is very upfront. And kind of an exaggeration of that. But as you look at a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, there's certainly that kind of flavor in there. We're not sure how this tale is going to go. Maybe your characters will die or whatnot. But this is going to be a game about this type of story or this type of theme. And it's interesting. One of the things that Ann R. said at one point was it wasn't so much. I think it was Ann that actually said this. I don't want to misquote them, but it's the idea. It's not about task resolution, but many times what you're doing is you're playing to find out what happens. Really interesting. And oftentimes a person like myself can say the same things. A lot of times we bandy around those terms. We're going to play to find out. Well, what are we trying to find out? Because sometimes what we're trying to find out are two very different things. And oftentimes, in a game like this, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm actually really pumped. There's a game that I got in the bundle that I think I might end up playing with Jason, and that game is actually kind of a space opera sort of game. Uncharted Worlds looks really interesting. So and I want to talk a little bit more about that game, but a little bit more about part of what that game says, which is different than what I normally do. So there's this difference between playing to find out, okay, let's find out how this story about our band of space explorers, how do they, as we're like, it's like being on Firefly or something. We kind of know what's going to happen, sort of, the type of story it's going to be. But let's play to find out all the nuances. Let's play to find out what happens, here, how that story comes together, versus something like myself would generally gravitate towards a game where we're playing to find out, or maybe I would even play that game this way. Let's just go back to this. We're going to play these space pirates. We're going to play to find out what happens. We're not sure what kind of story it's going to be. Maybe there's no heroics at all. Maybe our ship crashes and burns. We're playing to find out. But it's different than playing to find out the nuances of what happens in that arc. A lot of times games like Powered by the Apocalypse, games like Fate, and a bunch of other games, they talk about the idea of moving the story forward. And I forget which person said this to me in the conversations I've been having, because I've been having so many. They talked about the idea that failure is uninteresting. That they really don't want that in the game. That's not what these games are about. It's not about success and failure. And a lot of the action really happens in the weak hits, because you've got the success with a complication or whatever, and that's to move the story forward. Now, I understand that, because but to me, I believe sometimes what the word that's missing in that talk is moving the correct story forward, because a lot of times failure moves the story forward as well. It's just a different story. Cervantes dies. The characters, our three intrepid characters in the town of Potsdam, seemingly behead a normal person in the middle of the street and then have to run for their lives because people think they just committed murder, as opposed to killing some horrific monster. That's what happened. That's the story that happened. They kind of failed in a way to hide what they were doing, and that moved the story forward. The story just went in a completely different direction than we thought it was going to go into. And so sometimes I believe what people mean when they're looking for, when they're coming at this with this narrativist creative agenda, where the game is supposed to be about this type of story, that failure often moves the wrong story forward. And by changing that to success with some failure, or some kind of threat, you're still moving the story forward. You're still keeping people on edge. Little bit different. And it's based on intent. Nothing wrong with it, but really kind of interesting. The other thing, and probably the more important thing, or maybe just as important, is how Powered by the Apocalypse games tend to handle narrative authority. Who gets to be in control of what happens in the world, like what's actually real. And so let's go back to this game, Uncharted Worlds. It talks a lot about the idea that when characters find something out, etc., the game master should ask them, well, hey, what is this like? What is this world like? What's the primary export here? You've been here before. When they want to know what the criminal factions are, it's like, well, you're a criminal. You should know what the criminal factions on this world that you guys just went to were. Or we've just encountered a threat. You rolled some kind of miss, so all of a sudden one of your pictures is up on the most wanted list. Whose is it and why? And that sort of thing. So it encourages you. And these games, if you read most of them, they do a lot of that, encouraging the game master to put narrative control in the hands of the players. And sometimes what happens is the actual dice rolls themselves put a lot of narrative control into the hands of the players. It's now your turn to say what happens. It harkens all the way back to the pool. And you can look at my video about that in the deep end of the pool. The first game where it formalized handing narrative authority over to a player. That is one of those things that instantly changes or is this big demarcation line. Are you playing a game which is simulationist in nature, or are you playing a game which has a more narrative creative agenda? And here, once again, in a situation like that, the players now, there's not a single point of authority for what's real in the world. And at that point, even if I'm trying my darndest to play like I'm a real person, I'm one of these space pirates or whatever it happens to be, on this spaceship, and we're on something like Firefly or Farscape or the Nostromo or whatever. At the point where all of a sudden I'm being told or asked to or expected to make up something about the world here, I am no longer having that simulationist in-character experience. I'm going out and I have more of an author stance over the story at that point, rather than an actor stance, character stance. And I think understand the difference between that. where I'm playing my character, I'm an actor, I'm that guy, versus now I have some authority over what's real in this particular section of the world. There's nothing wrong with that, but that completely changes the feel of the story, or of the game rather. And so, to a certain extent, I believe that I could go ahead and play that Uncharted World game or something like it, or a generic version of a game like that, just using the mechanic. And even when it comes down to things like combat or whatnot, there's no opposed rolls. The game master never rolls. In situations like combat or whatnot, it's just a lot of narrative authority. At this point, probably more appropriately, you're making a global roll. You're deciding, instead of rolling for each little situation here, you make this roll. Okay, the combat went exactly the way you wanted it to. Okay, well, maybe it went mostly the way you wanted to, but there's some kind of threat. It could be that you got hurt. It could be that you didn't kill them all. They got away. It could be that something happened, misfortunate, or it could be that you got your butt kicked. But then you're in charge of the global description of what that is. I believe you could still do that in a very simulationist manner. But if you're playing a game where you're just using that mechanic, and you're not taking into account those other parts, which are they're not the mechanical rules of Powered by the Apocalypse games, but you read those games and it's very clear that there's a lot of narrative authority being given to the players at certain points in time, and also this is going to be a story about this kind of theme or this kind of story, even to the point where one of the reasons that the moves, they infuriate me, because they're these, every single one has these different series of moves, and they have these cool names and whatnot, and you have to wrap your head around, like, what? Wait a minute, which move am I triggering here? Part of the deal is those moves are kind of tailor-made towards those games because they're about the fiction. Are they still conflict resolution? Yeah, they're still conflict resolution. I would agree. I would argue there's a bit of semantics at that point, but those moves are about conflict resolution that's important to the fiction. And the actual list of things that can happen, those three results, they're tailor-made to that type of fiction and that type of story. So they might not be the three type of consequences, or the consequences may look different than if I wrote them, and they were more about this is probably what would realistically, I hate to use that word, happen in a situation like this. This is more about, okay, what's going to always move that kind of fiction forward and give us that kind of story, so we don't push the wrong story forward. We're making the wrong story just unavailable. So we're always going to have the right kind of story. We're not sure all the details. So that was just some of the thinking I did about that, or some of the conversations I've had with people. Really interesting, really fascinating stuff. It is amazing at the end of the day, how different some of our intentions are. And sometimes how we can just have misunderstandings. I am really looking forward to playing a bunch of these games and getting that kind of experience. It's not my first choice, however, I really like to take a look. I'd like to have some authentic, to use one of Jason's words. I want to have that authentic experience of playing some of these Powered by the Apocalypse games. But I'll be honest, I may steal a mechanic and run a more simulationist version of it, but it won't at that point. I don't think I can really say I'm playing my own hack of Powered by the Apocalypse, because it won't quite be that anymore. What do you think about that?